welcome to the last talk of this Gen AI session. Irene is going to be talking to us about all roads lead to ChatGPT, how generative AI is eroding social interactions in student learning. Personally, I definitely have felt this in my class and socially, so hopefully we'll learn a lot from Irene. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, my name is Irene. I am a first-year PhD student at UC San Diego, and this work was done in collaboration with Professor Stephen McNeil at the Temple HCI Lab. Thank you for the introduction. Let's just go ahead and get started. To sort of set the scene, in 2023, 34% of students had never used generative AI. You can see here on the left is a figure of the preferences that students had towards other help-seeking resources compared to generative AI tools like ChatGPT. You can see that Gen AI came in at 4th place. It was outranked by online search, which included Reddit, Stack Overflow, Google. It was outranked by friends, and it was outranked by class forum. However, in the span of 1 year, by 2024, 94% of students were reporting using ChatGPT at least once a month. And you can see in the preference ranking, it rapidly surged in popularity and it nearly beat out online search. There was actually only a 2% difference between online search and generative AI. So in a very short amount of time, generative AI has become this really widely adopted help-seeking resource for CS students. What's driving this increased usage? A lot of things, right? Generative AI is great at providing that high-quality, timely, and scalable assistance. Students can really progress past those common sticking points. They do less wheel spinning without having to expend any social energy or social capital. A lot of our students in prior work did mention other factors at play as well. It's not just that these tools are available and accessible, but some other things come up in these conversations with students. So just as a thought exercise, I want you guys to imagine you're a first year in CS again. I know that's quite a long way back for some of you, but imagine you're in the lab, you're stuck on a bug before a deadline. Remember how that feels? And what are some of the fears and concerns running through these students' minds? Well, they might be thinking, who do I go to for help? What if I'm by myself in the lab? Or maybe I don't know how to ask the right question, I don't know how to phrase my question. What if the person I ask rejects me? What if I look incompetent? All of these were real fears that students talked about when it came to the barriers that generative AI helped them overcome. These are the social emotional barriers, for example, fear of rejection, fear of appearing foolish or stupid or incompetent. Students can rely on these Gen AI tools to avoid that social pressure and avoid burdening peers or instructional staff. So generative AI provides that scalable, that timely, that burdenless assistance. It's available to you when you're alone, it's available when you're with others. That made us kind of run into this question, what are the impacts of these tools then on that peer interaction and collaborative learning? What happens in the classroom? You know, if we're all getting help from AI assistants, what happens to the relationships between students and maybe their instructors? So to sort of start answering this question, we conducted 17 semi-structured interviews with students across 7 North American R1 universities. These were students recruited via online forums, announcements by faculty, student work posts. And in these interviews, students discussed the pros and cons of generative AI resources compared to other resources like internet search or friends or instructors. They also shared their real observations and experiences. These were quite natural conversations. They liked to share the stories of the things they had experienced. And we did a thematic analysis of these interview transcripts. This data was collected between June and October of 2024. And here's a quick breakdown of the participant demographics. So we saw 17 students across a range. They were slightly skewed towards older students, but they were generally quite varied in the frequency and usage habits of generative AI, as well as across multiple different kind of computing majors, including data science or computer engineering or interaction design. Some of these students had previously used Gen AI tools before, but now do not use these tools. Some of these students use these tools regularly. Others were more sporadic help seekers. And we did have students who had never used these tools before as well. One major trend that we saw emerge was generative AI was serving as this sort of intermediary in help-seeking interactions. What do I mean by intermediary? So, for example, P3 is a novice student, first-year student, expressed a moment of vulnerability when she was talking to a peer about struggling with a programming problem. She reached out for help, and her peer responded with, "Oh, just ChatGPT that instead." She observed this as a big change within the last year. From the other perspective, or the other end of that interaction, P16, who was the one doing that sort of referral, shared that his peers would sometimes ask him a question, and he would just copy and paste it into ChatGPT and give it back to them. And these students were like, "Oh my god, you helped me so much," and he said, "I actually did nothing." Again, it's such a thing now. So remember when I had you guys imagine that first-year student, alone in the lab, really struggling. Think of the social-emotional barriers this P3 might have had to overcome in order to, ask for help or to reach out for help. She has to get her information, she needs to get her information needs met, she might have to overcome that fear of rejection, and then she receives that sort of response, that dismissive response of, "Oh, just ChatGPT that instead." How might that feel? So for students like P3 who ask for help and are rejected or redirected, they might be more reluctant to engage in this sort of help-seeking interaction in the future, especially given the pre-existing social-emotional barriers. This interaction becomes quite transactional rather than genuinely social support. Other related trends emerged as well. So we saw this loss of opportunity for meaningful peer interaction. And this happened to students who did not use generative AI. So P5, who does not use these tools and chooses not to use these tools, shared that even if she doesn't use these tools, she still feels like she indirectly uses it. Because when she asks her peers for help, they just send her what they got out of GPT. So she called this experience inevitable. She says, "Even though I haven't personally used it, it feels inevitable." Another student talked about how, even though he knew that his friends were able to provide that sense of camaraderie or that sense of emotional support, if GPT is able to solve it, then I'm just not going to ask. So this perceived cost of asking a friend for help, that time, that social cost, whether that effort, for many of these students is often no longer worth paying. I think P5 says it best. So P5 is a returning student, so she left university for 2 years, then she came back to finish her degree, and she described this new environment as feeling like a culture shock. She described it as culture shock. Unlike how it was a few years ago, all roads lead to GPT. This language suggests that this type of interaction may have evolved into an acceptable or maybe even expected norm in help seeking. Well, many students are able to kind of talk about the tangible benefits in generative AI when it comes to addressing specific informational needs. Very few students acknowledge the intangible benefits of human assistance. So some examples of that would be like the hidden curriculum. Those are things like, how do I practice my soft skills, developing the network with the people that are important, maybe even just resources on who's the best professor, how do I get an internship, maybe even just water cooler talk, right? All of that is much more tacit. That's not really explicitly taught in these classrooms. And P4, who's a novice student, talked about how, when she asked a human for help, she has to read their tone, she has to practice articulating the question, she has to look at their face, are they in a rush? Versus with ChatGPT, you don't have to be polite. P6, who's an honors CS student, shared that he noticed this new disconnect. There is this over-reliance on AI by many students, and they're not really understanding the problems, but they're also not asking people who work in the field for help. There's a disconnect or a loss of interaction between the entry level and the more experienced students. While students can get debugging assistance from Gen AI, the more tacit and tangible knowledge becomes a lot harder to access when they are engaging with their peers. Like I mentioned before, things like how do I get involved in a research lab, what resources are available to me at the school if I want to seek an internship. Human conversations often have that added benefit of getting knowledge that you weren't really intending to get. But as students miss these small opportunities for interaction, they're potentially missing entry points into the community and opportunities for legitimate peripheral participation. Gen AI cannot replace this mentorship and this type of access. We also know that peers inspire and motivate each other. P17 talked about how his classmates' feelings, their passions, the desires, whatever drives them, all that impacts him. He said that seeing a friend interested in designing this generative AI system made the topic really interesting to him. And again, this type of drive, the unique interests and passions of our peers in our community, that can't be replicated by generative AI. It also made sense that students went on to describe impacts to their community and feelings of isolation. P2, who is a daily user of generative AI, talked about how he's already someone that doesn't go out of his way to kind of interact with others, and so if he's relying more on GPT, he might be more isolated in his room instead of having to go out and talk to people. Participant 16 shared how in his community, they used to have discords for every class, but these days, back then people used to ask questions about doing homework or share memes, but these days these spaces have gone a lot more quiet. We have the Discord now in these classes, but nobody really talks because most or all the questions are answered by ChatGPT. So there's signs that these social spaces that students really depend on are eroding as well. Students also described generative AI usage and the perceptions around it quite negatively. There's a lot of negative self-talk. They feared being judged as lazy or stupid or foolish. People were scared to use these tools despite given explicit permission by professors in order to use them in front of other people. They were kind of afraid of being judged for that. There was also this sentiment that perhaps people who use these tools are less intelligent. Again, students feared this sort of judgment. They were very negative about this sort of behavior or use. So these experiences around shame and stigma surrounding Gen AI use really indicates that, while students are relying heavily on these tools, that private reliance is really coexisting with public hesitation. And this reliance on generative AI may potentially be internalized as a sign of personal or academic inadequacy. So this student described it as, if someone, a stranger sees me using AI, it's potentially them seeing my failures. Why does this matter? Well, we know student computing identities are socially constructed. We know that students lean on each other for social and emotional support, for motivation, and we know that sense of belonging is historically linked with retention. These are all factors that drive student persistence, motivation, and engagement, and they're factors that are important to student outcomes outside the university and in their careers as well. Student responses to these interviews suggest feelings of isolation that are compounded by the erosion of the social spaces upon which they rely. Gen AI could risk eroding the social aspects of our learning environments, where peer interaction and connection often underpins that student success. We don't just go to school to learn that explicit knowledge. We often go to build community, to make friends that last beyond the school, and for a lot of those skills that you develop only through experience. Gen AI tools may be reshaping the social fabric of computing education. When we no longer find the social cost of help worth paying, given instant, high-quality alternatives, we lose meaningful opportunities for building connections with our peers, our mentors, and our community. Again, this affects students that don't use these tools as well, as I kind of mentioned before. So what are the implications then for practitioners and beyond? One is that generative AI risks further marginalizing students that face prior disadvantages, informal opportunities that serve as entry points into the community through legitimate peripheral participation may be harder to access. These students don't come from backgrounds or families that have that sort of technological background. They disproportionately may be impacted by the loss of these informal opportunities. And as educators, we need to be increasingly mindful about fostering these peer interactions and healthy learning environments. There are some limitations to this work, primarily being that the perspectives and impacts are qualitative and subjective. It focuses on 7 Western universities, so cultures may differ. And we do need additional work to further quantify the extent of these qualitative observations. However, I would like to remind you that this work does represent the lived experiences of 17 students. The goal of this work is to provide critical insights, but not necessarily to generalize to every learning context. Just a quick summary of the takeaways of this talk. GenAI is interfering with student help-seeking interactions. It's not a replacement for mentorship or community, and it can't replicate the passion, the drive, and motivation of one's peers and community. Students shared feelings of stigma, shame, isolation, and related to their AI use. And the social fabric of these learning communities may be at risk. So, as a call to action to educators, we must be increasingly mindful about intentionally fostering engagement and collaboration in our classrooms. The QR code for the paper link is to the left. If you guys have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Thank you very much.
Great talk. I'm very happy you're talking about something like this. So I noticed based on the interviews that you conducted that there is a lot of cognitive dissonance arising in some of these students. So I was wondering, based on the interviews, if you could, I guess, share with us some of the statements that students used to justify their use of AI despite the negative self-talk, because I'm sure they probably have noticed.
Well, and this is a question, thank you for the question, by the way. This is something that came up in prior work as well. A lot of these students talked about how the temporal and the spatial limitations of getting help from instructors or TAs were just really challenging. So, I mean, I go to a very large university, or I went to a very large university, so you'd often have to wait, 6 hours to get help from a TA. For many of these students, it might just be like a very small bug that they need assistance with. So, that's 6 hours of their time where they can't make progress. So that is like a very critical aspect that these students brought up, where they're like, I can just get the help I need, I can actually understand this, but it does come at that cost, right? Like there's kind of this trade-off that emerges. But yeah, I think that's one of the main things that they brought up.
Awesome, thank you.
So in your study, was this use of AI based on this coding projects or something more general? So for example, helping the students understand concepts in computer architecture, chip design.
Yeah, we had, I believe 4 different types of use cases. It might be in the paper. It was conceptual knowledge, it was debugging, it was generating code, and it was ideation.
Great talk, thank you. Can you just comment on at the beginning you said that, okay, still online search is first and then GenAI is second. But actually, I think the line is getting blurred between those two. I mean, you do a Google search, half of the screen is filled up with now. So, what do you think would be the impact of that? Would these two categories merge actually next time?
Yeah, I'm almost certain they will start blurring together. This work was conducted before like AI insights were super heavily implemented. It might have been in beta testing at the time, so it was pretty clearly distinguished to students that it was like Google search, Stack Overflow, Reddit without the AI. But it probably needs a new category in the future. I'm sure students might not even know that they're getting AI assistance when it comes to typing in on Google. But that is something hopefully in the next iteration of this work we'll look at.
You mentioned at the end some quantitative work to complement the really interesting qualitative work you've done. Any thoughts about what kinds of, would this be survey data, would this be more administrative data, that what kinds of data sources would you look at?
I think survey data here could be really useful. I think getting, maybe a classroom of students to participate in a work, a larger 200, 300 student, those are the traditional introductory size courses. Maybe just gauging, how they feel at the beginning of the class, how they feel at the end of the class, and bringing in some of these elements would be really good. Hopefully we do have time to work on something like of that nature.
Hi, Kevin Lin, University of Washington, teaching faculty there. Great talk, thank you so much. I was curious about kind of like your thoughts on this. You've almost kind of like created a trajectory of like moving from friction to less friction with generative AI, with technologies, with like you were saying, going from 6 hours waiting to like no waiting. I'm kind of curious like how you might respond to that. Do you agree with that? Do you find that the data agrees with that? Do you have any suggestions for instructors who are trying to design for a world where students are accustomed to moving toward less friction? Should we try to push back against that, or should we like, embrace that? Should we embrace ideas of moving toward less friction? Because I've always kind of wondered, like, is it better to have some friction, and should we teach students to get used to that and to work in situations where learning requires friction, or work with them to take away that friction?
That's a really interesting question. I think there are two different kinds of friction though. So there's that positive, productive friction where, working through a problem, you can actually learn while you do it. But then there's also that unproductive, that wheel spinning where maybe you forgot like a bracket or something. That's not, students talked about this being like a very unproductive use of their time. So in some ways, I do think productive friction could be really useful for these students. But I think in other ways, this work kind of reflects maybe a tipping point in how education is being taught to students. Given that these tools exist now today, where you can have this sort of very personalized, very custom, very available technology, how can you maybe have that improve some of these student learning opportunities or experiences, while at the same time still building up those communities, because a lot of that needs to coexist with each other. So maybe, the call to action for educators is to look at how it's not just about friction, but it's also about what kind of learning environment you're cultivating for your students, right?
So, my name is Atika, and I'm from Nijmegen University of Science and Technology. We talked about the negative impact on the soft skills of the students using the GenAI. One of the things is the clarity that one should explain that what does I mean. This is also a soft skill. Do you think that there are some positive aspects of using GenAI? That means I want to say something and I cannot explain it. Then I ask ChatGPT that these are the statements I want. Can you say it in a tone that, in a positive way that other one can understand my words? Do you think that there is any positive aspects as well of using this ChatGPT or other tools using the GenAI, which are using GenAI on the soft skills in a positive manner?
I do think there are some positive aspects of that where, especially if you're maybe like a first-gen student or not a native speaker, it's really hard to maybe communicate the nuances of certain things to others. But I do think that you also can't exclusively rely on those technologies or tools to express yourself. And that's kind of the fear here, where students are kind of turning to this always on, always available, very accessible technology instead of engaging in that face-to-face practice. And that's what might be detrimental, not necessarily just the tool itself. So maybe how it's used or how professors or educators create boundaries or guidelines for this kind of use would be really helpful. Definitely positive in many ways, but yeah, it's a balance.
Hi, Armando from ITiCSE Berkeley. That was really cool. I'm curious whether your survey or your interviews with the students, was there a general question of the forum, how happy are you? Because it seems like it's possible that you can have a bunch of students who, by the standards of performance in their field, are doing acceptable work, even if they're relying on this as a crutch to do it, but as individuals, they're miserable because the social reward of doing it has been drained out of them. Did you probe for that at all?
I think if you check out the paper, you can see some of the things that students talked about that were kind of related to that. Definitely students expressed a lot of, like I said, isolation, and for them that's quite negative. They're in the past, something that we could do with our friends that's worth it is maybe we would all go to do a final project together, we'd stay up late, we'd be in the library, we'd work through this. But now, like I said, it's not really worth that cost. Sometimes for these students, I gotta get this assignment done, I gotta study for my exam. Maybe it's better if I just do it independently, or if I'm just at home with GenAI on the screen. And for many of these students, the reward for this kind of work is not the explicit grades or the assignments, but rather that networking or that discussion with others. Students talked about how sometimes they felt diverse conversation was being flattened. There was more everything was more homogenous. Students were less engaged in that sort of unique discourse, handwriting type of work. So I think in some ways students are quite unhappy, but we did not ask directly, are you happy? But a lot of their answers express that kind of under the surface.
Thank you.
We have time for one or two more.
Hi, thank you. I'm looking forward to stealing this presentation for a day one lecture to my intro students as to why I shouldn't do this. It's probably because I'm old, but I'm a little stunned at the feelings of shame and stigma that the students expressed. I would have expected that they would have almost felt pride at finding a clever way to help themselves or to cheat. Was that a topic with any of your interviews?
I don't think any students expressed pride in our interviews. They did express that it made getting help a lot easier. Like there was a lot less. Like I said, they were able to kind of overcome a lot of those social emotional barriers with ease. Most students actually, I think if you actually talk to students about this, and it depends on institution to institution. Like I think depending on the norms, the guidelines, the policy that the institution provides, like is this something that educators allow students to talk about? Do we have like a transparent guideline at the beginning of class so that students are aware of the expectations for how this tool is used? Versus is it kind of something that's like very implicit and taboo? People kind of do it under the table. For one of our students, she would not pull up the browser in a lecture hall because she was afraid people behind her could see her screen. And that depends, right? That depends on like the class, that depends on the school, that depends on the type of students. But many of these students, even if they didn't express like their own kind of negative self-talk, they expressed that other peers had this sort of perception. Like maybe you were not smart enough to do it on your own or something like that.
I think that's all the time that we have. Let's thank not only Irene, but all the fantastic speakers in this session.